So, first of all, who thinks Jesus really did exist as a historical being that walked around, despite we obviously don't think he was magic?
No, I mean,
Okay, that's what I used to think. I was raised Christian. My mom put a little. Okay, how do we do this?
Just point it this way. Point it over here. Not the center one, but the right. The right arrow. There you go.
There we go.
That's the guy.
Yeah, that's the guy. That's the guy. You found him. My brother and I shared a bedroom when we were little kids, and she put this picture up over the doorway, just to remind us who Jesus really was.
He's got blue eyes.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it great? Nice tan. Oh, look at that hair. Anyway, so I was raised Methodist, and when I was about 19, it just kind of slipped away. All religious stuff slipped away. And for the last few years, I've been really interested in the question, did a historical Jesus of some level really walk the land, even if he was called Joshua or whatever, okay? And so this talk is about that. I'll make it a little quick. Oops. Okay.
Full maximize.
Okay, cool. I hit this? Okay. So I looked for pictures of Jesus. There are dozens, hundreds of them on the web. I pulled out a couple of them right there. Thank you. Okay.
Cool.
Would you like me to run it from back here?
Yeah.
Am I doing something wrong?
It's the arrow. It's the arrow button. See how the green is a big round, and then it's not the top. Not the
Okay,
top.
so tonight, one thing I didn't see anybody talking about is the actual evidence of whether or not Jesus existed. Oh, okay.
Hey!
Great.
All right, continue on.
So that's what I'm going to be talking about, because evidence is what concerns me. I have a kind of a scientific engineering view of the world, so that's what we're going to be talking about. What evidence do we have? Well, we have the Bible. We have the Old Testament, New Testament, which consists mainly of the epistles written by Paul, Peter, and a few others. And we have the Gospels. Then we have other religions and myths of the time. And then we have what I call extra-biblical or outside the Bible evidence. So we're going to be talking about that. Right? Okay.
oh, the screen is just
Okay.
That's weird.
This is not engaged correctly or something. When I viewed it in PowerPoint.
See how it's...
Okay, there we go. Okay, it didn't tell me. Okay, so we have the New Testament. So I'll cover that. I'm not an expert on PowerPoint, so it's not coming out very as well as I thought. Okay, we have prophets who spoke actually to people at the time, but later on.
I'm sorry.
Don't push any buttons.
It's not you.
Okay.
This should have five.
Okay, here we go. Okay. We have,
I told you.
That's fine.
One more get fired.
All right.
okay, this is the Old Testament.
Just go.
Okay, we have different little bits where prophets supposedly spoke about things, but later on, I think were reinterpreted by men in the future, by men way off in their future, to say that they actually predicted Jesus. And two of the best known are Isaiah and Emmanuel, where he wrote, "Therefore the Lord Himself will give you a sign, and the virgin will be with child, and you will give birth to a son." The problem with this is what is really written, where he used the word Alma, means maiden, not virgin. So it's been widely mistranslated. And I'll go on to talk about a little bit more. And also, this was like 700 years before Jesus' full existence, which is just kind of silly to be talking about stuff 700 years in the future. Then we have Nazareth, Nazarite, Nazarene, these questions. I think that what happened was that the gospel writers were looking through what they call the scripture, which is really the reading in a translation in Greek. It's called the Septuagint. So they're looking through that because they may not have been able to read Hebrew. And so they're trying to find little things. So one little bit in there is where they talk about a boy that will be a Nazarite. However, a Nazarite is kind of a religious connotation, kind of like people who go off and spend time away from everybody else. They don't shave. So they mistranslated it into Nazarene and Nazareth. Okay, so this is a little bit better. We have the New Testament, we have the epistles, which are written by Paul and the other epistle writers. And if you really read them, they know practically nothing about the story we know of Jesus. Okay, they know nothing about where he was born, about any stories of his life, about the death, about anything other than pretty much the death and resurrection is the big part in Paul when he writes about this. And to him, Jesus is pretty much a sky god who exists as an intermediary between God way up there, who's way too far up from the humans. So this is a common theme in the midst of the time. We have an intermediary savior type that comes in between. Okay. Now Paul also wrote that he went to Jerusalem to meet with Peter, also known as Cephas, and James. And Paul writes that they told him nothing new. That he learned nothing from them, which is just insane if they had really known Jesus. But from everything I can tell, Peter and James and Paul were delusional apostles. Okay, an apostle is really called a messenger, whereas disciple is a follower. So Paul viewed himself as a messenger. And I think Paul just viewed Jesus as this delusional part in his brain. Also, Paul exhibits many characteristics of epilepsy. One strong characteristic of epilepsy, in addition to the epileptic fits that they have strong religious delusions. And some people who have epilepsy realize this. They realize it's just their brain playing tricks on them. Others think that it's real. So he had these very strong thoughts that he thought were real. He often talks about Jesus. He also refers to a thorn in him that is never really described, but it could have been his epileptic problems. Okay, now we have, of course, the Gospels. Now, the Gospels show a strong evidence of being mythical stories. Mark was the first of the Gospels, and it doesn't have much magical elements, many magical elements in it. It also stops just after the women leave the tomb. And then somebody added in the 2nd century about 12 more verses to give Jesus post-resurrection life. It has very little of the magic stuff that we like to think of. Then when Matthew and Luke and John came along and wrote their Gospels, Matthew and Luke copied extensively from Mark. And you can find it's like 60-90% of their words are either directly lifted or almost directly lifted out of Mark. Now, if they had been real eyewitnesses, they would have not needed to do this. They would not have needed to actually copy it. So I think it was just a progression. I think they found the story. They said, well, we can write better ones, and it just evolved over time. Okay, classic is they have different nativity stories. Everybody thinks, well, Jesus was born in a manger, and the shepherds, and the 3 kings, and this whole story. It doesn't exist in the Bible, except in separate pieces. We have Matthew, who has Jesus born in the home of Joseph, who lives in Bethlehem at the time. Then we have Luke, who tells the whole nativity story of them coming to town, and that whole silly story right there. They also differ by about 10 years in where they have Jesus being born. So even their stories don't corroborate. Plus, they both give a genealogy of Jesus, and they vary right with Joseph's father. They immediately start to split off. And Christians come up with all sorts of stories. So one of them is actually married, but nobody kept a genealogy of women because women at the time were not thought to contribute to the genes of the child. They just thought women were just a field in which he planted the seed. Greek for seed is sperm. So that's what women were thought of. It wasn't until actually fairly recently, in the last few hundred years, that women was recognized that women contributed to the genetics of the child. Even though we all know we can see people's facial characteristics in the children. Okay. When I was a kid as a Christian, Red Methodist, and the Sunday before Easter Sunday, we did Palm Sunday. Does everybody know the story of Palm Sunday? Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, and people are throwing palms out. So I'd stand there as a little kid, holding a palm kid. If you actually read it, Jesus is riding on 2 donkeys, on the backs of 2 donkeys.
How is possible?
Very strange. The reason for this is, in the Greek, in the Greek Septuagint, when they refer to a story of the king coming into the town, they seem to refer to 2 animals, but it's actually just a language style that actually means just 1 animal. But whoever wrote this was looking back. He's trying to find stories to be fulfilled in the life of Jesus, to add into the story to make it seem more real. So he says, well, it says 2 donkeys. Therefore, I'm writing 2 donkeys because we've got to fulfill the prophecy. So it's one more indication that the stories were written simply to fulfill prophecy, supposed prophecy. Okay, then there's a little bit in one of the Gospels where Jesus and his family, Joseph takes his family off to Egypt. But that comes from an incorrect translation of Hosea 11:1. So once again, they're trying to create stories to fulfill supposed prophecy and add them into the supposed story of Jesus. Let's see if this works. Okay. So another thing we can look at is other religions in this at the time. When I was raised a Christian, I had to go off to do our little teachings to learn how to be a good Methodist. Nobody ever told us this. That all these stories, like Jesus, were similar to many other stories at the time. There are about a dozen different gods and saviors who have similar stories as Jesus, where they died and came back to life, often in a violent birth. Many of them had a king trying to kill them as a child. So it's a common story of the time. And Jesus is just another character. And I think the Romans and many people saw this. There's just another mythology like the many other mythologies at the time, specifically Mithraism, which has a very similar story. And if you go to Europe, you can still see Europe, at least where we were in Germany, you can still see these kind of holes that they dug out for worship of Mithra at the time. And so Mithraism, I think as Christianity spread, Mithraism died out. Okay, so now let's look at the extra biblical evidence, meaning outside the Bible. We have historians of the first century. There are about 30 of them that we have writings from. I'm not an expert on this, so I take much of this stuff just with other people willing to read it. The most famous of them is Flavius Josephus. I'll get into him in a little bit. And we have Philo of Alexandria, who wrote extensively about the times. He traveled and wrote extensively about the times. And Seneca the Elder, and you can read them off. And then there are a few historians of the 2nd century, and Tacitus wrote in about 117. He referred to Christ, but added no information about Jesus other than what the Christians commonly know. He also referred to him as the Christ, which is a religious term, because Tacitus was secular. He was a Roman official at the time. He would have written using the man's name. But the fact that he used the Christ shows that I think he got all of it from the Christians. We're not doubting the Christians existed at the time. But the question is, did Jesus Christ exist? And that's what I'm looking at. Then Pliny the Elder, and there's one off the bottom that we can't see, also referred to Christians because they were trying to deal with them at the time. There's also a popular myth that the Romans were slaughtering them, feeding them to lions. This is largely a 2nd and 3rd century story that was written by Christians to help spread the faith. The fact that these people from before were such strong believers that they were willing to die for their faith was a really strong bit of evidence that they were trying to push on possible believers. They also, by the way, the Christians put forth the story of the strong sexual orgies that the Romans had. From what I've read, there's not much evidence for this any more than maybe nowadays in our times, but the Christians were trying to see how evil these Romans were. So this is another Christian myth that was spread at the time. Okay, Flavius Josephus. If you ever talk to Christians about evidence for Jesus, they will likely pop out Flavius. He's usually known as just Josephus. He's an interesting guy. He was a secular Jew, a Pharisee at the time. He was well respected. Some interesting stories about how he survived a mass suicide. He was the only one who walked out of it, and he kind of converted over to be with the Romans. And he joined the Flavian family. That's how he got the first part of his name. So in one of his books, he writes this right here. In his Jewish Antiquities, and I'll read it off for those of you who can't. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a 3rd day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. The tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Then there's one other little sentence that just barely mentions Jesus. Wow, you can't ask for much stronger evidence if this is all you have. Unfortunately, Josephus did not write it.
Yeah, that's straight out.
Pardon?
Well, that's pretty obvious that someone was pushing Jesus.
Yes.
I can't believe it was Josephus.
Well, we know Josephus did not write that because... okay, first of all, the sentence is just a little tiny sentence that barely mentions Jesus, and later on in it comes back and mentions another Jesus. Okay, Jesus or Joseph or whatever was a fairly common name at the time. Okay, the paragraph is an obvious forgery because, well, I'll go over my notes here. Okay, first of all, nobody heard about it before the Council of Nicaea, which if everybody knows the Nicene Creed, I believe in God the Father, blah, 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 blah. I had to learn as a kid. It comes out in Nicaea way back in like 324. It's been around that long. No Christian knew about it at the time. Even Origen, whose library that Eusebius had. So Eusebius was almost certainly the man who forged this. He just had it copied, and he inserted this paragraph in between two other paragraphs. We can tell it was inserted because the paragraph before it tells about Pilate. There's a scene where Pilate has his Roman soldiers off in a crowd and a preordained signal. The soldiers draw their swords and just slaughter everybody. Okay? Then we have this paragraph about Jesus being a great man, and then the next paragraph says, and then another terrible thing happened to the Jews. So it's obviously inserted. I'll let you go over the other points right here. Obviously, Josephus did not write this. It was inserted by somebody else. If Jesus had really existed, Josephus would have written extensively about it, even more than a paragraph and a sentence, because Josephus wrote extensively about many minor characters of the time, and he would have written. He did not. Neither did Philo of Alexandria, neither did any of the other about 30 historians of the time. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's just a quick overview. If you want to read more about this, Brian wanted about 15 minutes, so I just gave a quick overview of it. I've got a little website called Godless Geeks. You should be able to remember that. And on my front page, I've got a link to a much longer article that talks about it. So thank you for coming.
Stick around, I'm sure there's going to be some questions. I'm just going to moderate the questions, so everybody just raise your hand, yes round. Be number one.
You made the claim that the Septuagint mistranslate Nazarite as Nazareth or Nazarene. And
No, the Septuagint does.
I was going to say, that's because it's not true. The Septuagint doesn't. And that doesn't mean that the people who were claiming in the first century that Jesus was from Nazareth would have been influenced by that, because the initial people claiming it can be traced back to really early Gnostic Aramaic writings. So it appeared in Aramaic before it would have appeared in anything influenced by the Septuagint.
I've never heard that.
Not only that,
yeah.
Paul or any of the others who were writing about this would have been familiar with Septuagint, being Greek speakers, but Paul and the others, for instance, were also Jewish. So there's no way that being writing in Greek, but also being Jewish, that they would be confused by the difference between a Nazarene.
Plus, it didn't speak Greek very well.
Nazareth.
Now, I think this showed up really in the Gospels, and it could be that the Gospel writers. Now, you have to remember, there's a whole lot of changes that are going on. Largely, we don't know. People of many centuries ago, before we had printing, actual printing, knew that Bibles changed. Different versions have different stories. Typos slip in. People add a little bit. A favorite of mine is the story of Jesus and the adulteress. It's a great story. It's about your own personal responsibility. It never happened. We can tell that for one thing. The earlier copies of John, where it exists, doesn't have it. They don't have it. And two, at the end of the story, there's only Jesus and the adulteress. Who's telling the story? Where does this come from? Right. So it's just added to the story. Paul likely read the Septuagint. That's where Jesus is mentioned. The word Jesus is in there, from what I understand. So he would be familiar with the term.
Wait. So by the word Jesus is just a common name. It's one of those common names And it's just, we translate it in English as Jesus, we use the Greek, and the direct translation would be closer to Joshua. Same name, doesn't matter. It would have been, Greeks would have considered them the same name. It would have been the same name in Aramaic. Doesn't really matter. So that's kind of irrelevant. What's the point, though, that seems to me contentious is the claim that the Gospels would have pinned him from being from Nazareth because of the Septuagint's similar usage of words, which is kind of ridiculous because, first of all, I think especially something like Matthew. Matthew corrected any of the kind of misinterpretations of Greek. Mark introduced a number of kind of misunderstandings of Aramaic that he had. Matthew tended to correct this. He certainly would have corrected the confusion between Nazarite and from Nazareth. The other thing is that the fact that he was from Nazareth was actually really problematic for the gospel writers, which is why you have Matthew and Luke coming up with these ridiculous, wild explanations for how he can be from Nazareth and also from Bethlehem, because all of the Old Testament prophecies which relate to the Messiah, which does not include the verse in Judges, that was never considered by any of the old rabbis to be a passage relating to the Messiah. All of the messianic prophecies said that he was going to be from Bethlehem, not from Nazareth.
But Bethlehem was kind of a term. It's kind of like a tribe from what I call it.
No, it's a city.
Of Bethlehem, the way it's when I read it.
No, it literally means literally means born there. And so that can't be.
So they dream up this ridiculous story to try to pull Nazareth and Bethlehem into the same
it wouldn't
story.
have been in their interest to try to fictionalize that he was from Nazareth.
I don't know why, because people dream up a lot of wild-ass stories.
Because it's quite far away, too.
Okay, let's just move on to somebody else here. Go ahead.
I'd like to point out that in my experience, the Christians, for example, in my family, a lot of them really need to believe that Jesus really existed, at least as a person walking around, or as a God. It's absolutely central to their Christian belief. I was surprised to discover this because, being Mark's partner, I mentioned to my sister, a Christian, that apparently there's no objective evidence, no evidence outside the Bible that Jesus ever even existed walking around, never mind as a God. And she said, don't ever talk about this again.
Yeah, they don't want to get into a conversation.
No, I mean, apparently this is really central to a lot of people.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, I mean, like Robert Price, who considers himself a atheist Christian, I mean, you'll see guys like that who are okay with the fact that he can't, or he doesn't believe that Jesus was a real person, but he's okay with it. Yeah, but he still enjoys like the Christian tradition, and he can kind of get into it that way. Go ahead.
There are many reasons not to take the religious legends about Jesus seriously, his miracle-working prowess and his resurrection and so forth, but I haven't looked into this case of his non-existence very deeply, but I have yet to see anything that really supports the idea that he never even existed. He doesn't seem to have made much of a stir during his own lifetime, but that because he isn't referred to anybody contemporaneous.
My point was that if Jesus had existed, if he did anything, if he was even talking aloud, so he was well known. The Bible says he was known near and far. People would come all over to see him. That Jesus did not exist because people would have known about him, such as the 30 roughly historians at the time. They would have written about him.
Well, right. All kinds of stories would have developed about this guy later for any number of possible reasons, but that doesn't mean that Jesus himself never existed.
Is that then the Jesus at all? Well, even if he walked around saying nice things, my point is that Paul at least would have known about this, because Paul was alive roughly that time. He would have talked to Peter and James and many other disciples of the time, said, hey, tell me more about Jesus. Paul specifically points out that they told me nothing. Which means that Paul didn't exist, he didn't think that Jesus really existed. That was the key point for me. That was kind of the keystone that shifted my viewpoint on this.
Go ahead.
So two things.
Yeah.
One real short one. There was no Hebrew back then. It was Aramaic. Hebrew was invented 100 years ago, as it stands today. I'm from Israel.
So I did not know this. But
Yeah.
so what were scriptures?
Right.
Yeah.
What did she say?
It was ancient Hebrew. It's
It was
not-
Aramaic, not
When you read it,
That's what was spoken.
You're saying that Aramaic was spoken at the time of
No,
Jesus?
there's an ancient Hebrew and then there's a modern day Hebrew.
Oh, modern
Okay,
Hebrew.
So
it's
it's
not the
ancient
same.
Yes.
It's more Aramaic, and
I
I
see.
can't
Yeah.
understand it.
No,
It's
she's
different.
right.
English and Old English about being related.
It's
No,
worse.
she's right. It's Aramaic, what was spoken in the general public.
As far as
What Hebrew is, back then, is the sacred language that the priests use in their rituals.
Right.
And as you pointed out, modern Hebrew is actually something that was very useful in Israel, so that people had something to communicate. And a gentleman, I think I heard him on the radio about 2 years ago, talking about he was being honored because he developed a way of how to expand Hebrew to have the new words and the structure that they use today in Israel.
So the scripture, as they called it, was written in Old Hebrew.
Yeah, and
No,
it was
it's
Aramaic.
no,
It's Hebrew.
Greek.
It's Hebrew.
No, it's
Because
Aramaic.
You know, the people spoke
Hang on,
Aramaic,
everybody.
but the
Hang on.
Bible was, the New Testament was in Greek.
Okay, did you have a second part to your question?
Yes, I
okay.
did.
Go
Thank you
ahead.
for remembering. The other thing I was going to point out was I have no vestige as to whether or not Christ existed. All I know is that when I was in Israel, people said he was from over there, and that was that. But there was a show on, I think, PBS in the past couple of years that looked at archaeological evidence, whether or not Jesus existed. So I was wondering why that
There is none. There is, even the well.
This is a question about
There's not
archaeological
that I
evidence.
know of. Okay, all evidence. I mean, there was the bone box, supposedly, that's been shown to be a forgery.
Without a doubt.
Right?
And
I mean, there's a lot of money to be made. Hey, come here, I'll show you where Jesus was born.
Yeah.
Just pay me some money, I'll take you there. Here's where Jesus, here's the true cross, or here's what it was. Here's what the cross
Here's
was.
the four places he was baptized at.
Well, it's interesting because Constantine's mother came down there and she was looking for all kinds of artifacts. She was looking for all kinds of artifacts, and it seemed as though she would just grab anything that somebody told her was of importance. Oh, this is the cross that Jesus was killed on, or this is where he was buried, and they would just take that on, just okay, well, that's what they said. There was no evidence behind it. It's just that's what they said. Did you have anything else?
I had one question, one statement. When you described, and you had it actually up there, when you said that Paul made a statement about not having evidence, you used the phrase, no new evidence.
Right.
Whoa!
Nothing new. Like you
That's
said, you learned nothing from these guys.
Whoa,
Right.
come on. There's a contradiction in that statement itself. That's all I'm pointing out. I have learned nothing new implies he knew something before. So the point being, there was nothing new added to whatever knowledge base he had. I don't know what knowledge base he had, at all, other than he initially was supposedly a persecutor of Christians, and then on Damascus he has his, flaming whatever, and then he becomes a convert. Now that's the story, okay?
Right.
But I would just want to use the phrasing there if you want to. Well, don't say nothing new is what I would say that covers
Well,
the track.
my point is, Paul writes nothing about pretty much a living Jesus as we think of it. Paul writes nothing about the moral stories of Jesus.
Okay, then I would just make one critique is don't use nothing new because it implies there's something there.
Well, Paul had a vision of Jesus. Paul had a very strong vision of Jesus. It came to him, if we believe
Oh,
the
those
stories
are
and
the
what Luke and that wrote about them in Acts and in other places, that Paul had this, what looks like an epileptic fit.
Well, you call it epileptic, but people have many, what you call, the religious experiences of visions and whatever. It's not a new phenomenon.
Right.
Many people have it.
So my point is, he likely had one of those. And if
Who
Jesus
said
had,
so?
my point was, my point is an argument from silence.
Somebody
to a
said
great
that
degree.
Paul said so.
If
Obviously.
If Jesus had really existed, things would have been different. Paul would have asked Peter and James and any other apostles, tell me more about Jesus. Show me where he walked. Show me this. Show me that. Okay? He did not. So to me, everything points to Paul and Peter and these other apostles, meaning messengers, just having this somewhat shared vision that they extracted out of reading Scripture, of this heavenly.
Logical forensics is what I mean.
Okay, let me just move on.
Okay.
Ryan has something he wants to say. Go
So
ahead.
in addition to the fact that it's true that there doesn't actually, the fact that Jesus didn't write very much doesn't mean he didn't know much more. We don't know how much he knew but didn't write.
But, okay.
So, in addition to that, he did write quite a number of details about Jesus' life. He didn't go certainly into the details of the gospel did, but just to name a few things, he did mention that Jesus had an earthly life that he lived. He mentioned that he mentioned his ancestry. He mentioned.
Not that I know of,
He
not
mentioned.
Paul.
Yeah, he mentioned. Okay.
Well, he talks about his brother.
No. He mentions that he's a descendant of David.
And he doesn't even say, he says,
Romans 1:1. He said Romans 1:3. He mentions.
okay, now there's a problem with Romans and with many other, as I mentioned earlier, scholars much more knowledgeable than I, with much more time to spend on than I'm willing to, show that much of the Bible has been modified in later times. People have changed it as new copies have come across. That several of the letters, supposedly epistles of Paul, were not actually written by him.
So Romans is the one they use to measure the other epistles.
Okay.
Romans is the most valid of all things that Paul ever wrote.
Right.
And Romans says several things. Romans alone, we can go on that Jesus lived on earth, Jesus was a descendant of David, Jesus was killed by the Romans, Jesus
Actually,
was
Paul
resurrected.
said, from what I've read, Paul says Jesus was killed by spirits.
Sorry, he was
spirits.
crucified. The crucifixion of Jesus is mentioned about a half dozen times in the valid epistles of Paul.
But Paul writes nothing.
No, that's true. So, but Paul's not an eyewitness to any of this. But you can't say that Paul didn't write about these things about Jesus because he didn't mention at least
And the main details of Jesus' life.
I think Ryan could have put a cage match
The main
between
details
Ryan
of
and Mark.
Jesus' life. The Christians like
Okay,
to go on.
Joel is losing. He's losing this. Okay, go ahead.
The main points of Jesus' life. When I was raised a Christian, he lived such a moral life. He had all these moral stories. Paul has many instances where he could have referred back to Jesus for his moral state, for Paul's own moral statements. But Paul specifically says what he got came from no man.
For one particular thing, yes.
Yeah.
For
Okay.
one teaching.
When he goes to Jesus, I can't quote it. I can look through my article a little bit. But Jesus, he says, Paul, what came from no man. It was given to him.
Yeah, there's one teaching that didn't come from Jesus.
Pardon?
So that one teaching didn't come from Jesus.
No, he says what? Well,
No, he has
as I read it,
he has one thing, and that's about divorce. He says that divorces are wrong, and this didn't come to me from Jesus. To say that that's about all of Paul's teachings is also false.
But
There's
Paul,
one thing.
Paul never references any of Jesus' moral teachings.
That's not true. In fact, Thessalonians says
That I know of.
Thessalonians says that he was
That
encouraging them following
have
the
been
example of Jesus
modified
Christ
later.
as they were living their good life.
Okay. So
Hang on, everybody.
So
Take a
let me
breath. Deep breath. Joel would like to ask something. Go ahead, Joel.
I noticed you mentioned nothing about the absence of any historical records of Jesus' childhood and his teenage years and all that.
Even in the Bible,
Right.
rather than
And to
when he
me,
was 12.
that's from my perspective, that's a red flag against the existence of Jesus. What I mean, that might be sound like a double negative, but what I mean is it points strongly against his existence, because you look at other historical figures, Abraham Lincoln, Christopher Columbus, whoever, and the historians, they want to dig up, what did these guys do when they were kids? How was their childhood? What kind of home did they grow up in? And do we see a lot of that about Jesus?
But admittedly, history is probabilistic, especially when you start going back in time. Did Abraham Lincoln exist? Yes. 99.99, we ever had probability. Did somebody else exist 2,000 years ago?
That's not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at the lack of documentation of what Jesus' childhood.
So it's an argument from silence once again.
Yeah, they kind of gloss over that, right? They just gloss over it.
His birth is this miracle, and then 30 years later you don't hear anything until all of a sudden he's preaching on a mountain.
Well, you didn't hear about 12-year-olds.
Why is that?
You didn't hear about the 12.
Yeah. Go ahead. You got one here. Hang on.
I have got to find out what your source material is.
Where do you get most?
Okay,
Where do you
some of
get your argument?
Some of this comes from a good friend of mine named David Fitzgerald, who wrote a book called Nailed. We have Richard Carrier speaking soon. He's coming out with a book sometime early 2014. It will be his third book, I think, on the historicity of Jesus, where he has come out as a mythicist. He thinks that Jesus is just a myth too. Both of them have done far more research than I've
Are
had
these
time to.
sources on your website? I mean, can we check these
Yes,
sources out?
I mean, you can. I have links to them.
Okay.
You can read Dave Fitzgerald's Nailed book. It's a delightful book to read. I thoroughly recommend it to anybody who wants far more information that I was able to put forth, and I'm able to put forth in my argument.
One more thing.
Okay, quick.
The Jesus Seminar is right down here in Santa Cruz, and they've done extensive research on Jesus and come to the conclusion that he did exist as a man. Now, whether you can believe he was divine or not, that's up to personal interpretation. But they feel in their academic work that Jesus was a real man, and they document the time he lived in. So a lot of the assumptions that we make as modern people about what life was like for them at the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago was way different. We don't have the same, they didn't have the same aspects, they didn't have the same sense of history that we've developed since then.
Right, but if you look at the evidence that they put forth, they have, you have to look at the evidence. I mean, by and large, most biblical scholars are Christians.
Yeah.
And they have a very strong vested interest.
You don't know the Jesus Seminar then.
Well, not all of the Jesus Seminar agreed either.
No, they don't.
And so the question is, why didn't they agree? Why didn't these other scholars agree? You know, it's a very problematic. But I'm looking at the evidence. They have a strong vested interest in thinking Jesus existed. I noticed you were nothing wrong. You were unable to put forth any evidence either, and that's fine.
No, I can't.
Actual evidence that Jesus existed.
Yeah, some of the things that you
Other
put
than
up
what other
there
people say.
Well, that's the
my
difference. Is I have to evaluate your source. Is your source valid compared to my source?
Typically,
and I don't know your source.
Typically, I showed my source. I refer to the Bible. I refer to the historians of the time. It's an argument from silence, admittedly, and I refer to the other myths that show many, many, many similarities to Jesus.
Your extracurricular sources are.
Well, they're admitted.
Your interpretation of them.
Okay, so I think we can agree that this is not something we're going to solve today.
We're so close.
Yeah.